Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. What are the similarities and differences between Mormons and Pentecostals? I asked that question to Dr. Christopher Thomas. He teaches at the Pentecostal Theological Seminary and has written this amazing book, A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. So we're going to talk more about his book, which you should buy, by the way, as well as the similarities and differences between Mormons and Pentecostals. You definitely want to check this out. Well, one of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about how Mormonism and Pentecostalism are similar. We were talking a little bit about the word of wisdom. We also, at BYU, they have a dress code, and in some versions of Pentecostalism, there's a very strict dress code.
Yep.
And so I think there's some similarities that you probably know more about than I do. Could you talk about some of these similarities between Pentecostalism and Mormonism?
Well, the version of Pentecostalism I grew up in is kind of the holiness tradition. And there were real clear kind of dress mores, right? I mean, the women seemed to bear a disproportionate amount of the weight of those. In my tradition, women were really looked down on if they didn't wear dresses or something something similar to a dress. They couldn't wear pants, for example. Mm-hmm. Sure couldn't do that in church, but just in normal attire. And I remember as a boy hearing discussions of women who worked in factories saying, well, I know we're not supposed to, but it is not decent for me to not wear pants, being up on the next floor. The people could see up their dresses, etc. We were pretty concerned about what we called unnecessary jewelry. Now, not all Pentecostals would have been like that, but it was an attempt to deal, I think, with kind of ostentatious displays, right? We were teetotalers, still are, our tradition. We don't have anything like, well, early on, there was a question about whether you could drink Coca-Cola or not, because early on it had a bit of Coke in it.
Right.
And so we may not have been completely wrong about that one. And one of the big differences would be dancing was taboo.
Right.
Footloose. That's right, completely taboo. So you would, those kinds of negotiating, the culture always presented a challenge. Now, I was fortunate in that my parents would normally say something like, if I asked about a certain activity, they would say, well, what do you think the Bible says about it? And I had peers whose answer that they would get from their parents was, well, the church doesn't believe in such and such. But they would always kind of push it back on me to try to discern through those situations. And of course, growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, the whole society was kind of shifting, right? And so in some places in church, the question was how long your hair was. In high school, the question was, do you smoke pot, right? And so trying to navigate all of that without, I quite liked the Beatles among other musicians.
With their long hair.
That's right. That's exactly right. May have been the reason. You can tell I've never recovered from that time. So, as I think back through it, I was part of this kind of intense community of believers, and we were trying to find our way. What I discovered pretty early on was that when you're thinking about holiness of life and sanctification, kind of wholehearted devotion to God, that you have to almost figure that out anew every generation, because the questions and the issues change so much. in our tradition, I think what happened was we had people really concerned with pleasing God and living in holy ways, and where they came out in their discernment kind of got fossilized for the next generation.
Right.
But that doesn't work, and I think the kind of what can happen in holiness tradition sometimes is people just give up, right, and say, well, we know this kind of legalism is not the way forward. I think the church has tried to be responsive to what it means. There were certain people, it wasn't in my home, but there were certain people that would not watch television, right, and some people that would preach against it because of its worldly influence, or going to movies. That's you're associating with kind of worldly folk. These days, the hogs are in with the chickens. I mean, if somebody's concerned about holiness of life, you're glad to see it, right? And when you think about our kids and the different questions they face every day, and the questions I faced every day, and then I think about what it's going to be like for my grandkids. You have to be able to discern your way forward in a way that has integrity, but also makes those discerning judgments along the way. And I think sometimes people in religious traditions are afraid to empower younger people to try to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Mormons, from the bit I know, I mean, they reminded me in a lot of ways of the holiness tradition and this desire to please God in that way. Word of wisdom, clearly not thought up by people who live in England and have a cup of tea every day. But you can argue that there are.
But it's iced tea, right? Not hot tea.
Well, no, that's the South right there. That's right. You do have similar impulses, I imagine. But I remember when I first started to learn about Mormonism, the whole thing with dancing was just such a bridge too far.
Because Mormons danced? Is that
when I heard how significant dancing was in the community, right? And but holiness folk would tend to have similar assessments of other Christian groups that went to dances, right? Mm-hmm. So it's funny what people do and don't get.
So I don't know. I think you went through my interviews, and I think you told me you skipped one, and it was with Joseph Freeman. He grew up in the Holiness Church, and one of the things he told me was they didn't like, well, at least in his congregation, and I don't think this is Pentecostal wide, but that they didn't even like you to do sports.
Well, when I was a young guy, pre-10, I remember that there was a brother in our church who was a leader in our church. He was what we called a councilman, who left the council because he went to see his son play, may have been football or basketball, regularly. And I remember talking to my parents about it and saying, well, what's that about? And it was interesting how kind of discerning their response was, because it was a mixture of, there are people in the church that don't believe that we should be going to these kind of worldly amusements. Mm-hmm. But he really loves his son so much that he's willing to make this sacrifice. And of course, within a few years, that was not an issue anymore. But my dad started teaching a Sunday school class. He was a really good athlete, my dad, and he got a little bit of criticism when he would would take the young men that he was working with, rent a high school gym and have a time of playing basketball together. So, there were people that had these real rigid notions.
And every church has a basketball court.
Right. Well, we should have known more Mormons. We were usually at a grammar school or something like that.
That's funny.
But yeah, the taboos, often they make sense in terms of a story, but what often happens is the story gets forgotten and all you're left with are the kind of structures. Mm-hmm. And I think it's up to each generation to kind of try to figure that out.
Right. Now I have another question for you. I know that with Casey Griffiths, I used to joke that he was Bishop Dr. Casey Griffiths, and same with Mark Staker. And I think I heard that you played the role of a bishop or pastor. Is that a true story?
Yeah, in our denomination, we have 3 ranks of ministry. Okay. We have what is called a licensed minister, which is sort of the initiate level. If you're just being called into ministry, you'd probably go there. Then we have what we call ordained ministers who have more responsibilities and have more opportunities in that regard. And women can actually fill both of those roles. And then we have what's called ordained bishop, which is kind of the highest rank of ministry that there is theoretically you can serve at any level in the church. So you could be the presiding bishop, for example. Mm-hmm. It used to be that 3rd rank was simply called ordained, but then at some point they changed it to ordained bishop. And of course, part of the problem is there's a diversity of ways in which the New Testament defines these terms. And it looks like at the church at Philippi, for example, that there are several bishops, episkopoi, the Greek term. And so people will construct with biblical language different kinds of structures, right? So they were pretty disappointed when I was in England studying to find out I was a bishop, because they expected a lot more.
Not a Mormon bishop or a Catholic bishop, just a Pentecostal bishop.
That's right. That's right.
So you don't wear robes or anything?
Well, the hat's the best part of being a bishop, but we've not managed to get us a hat yet. That's what one of my colleagues said. He said, we really need to get us a couple of bishop hats. I said, wear to the church meetings. I said, man, that's the best part of being a bishop. So what do you do as a bishop? Are you still a bishop then? Yeah, that's kind of my ministerial rank. It's a bit of an anomaly because for like a state bishop who's over the state of Tennessee, the ministry of the Church of God in the state of Tennessee, that kind of makes sense, right? And then we have these districts that we might have a district bishop who usually is the pastor of the largest church on the district, called a district church, right? This is really way down in the weeds on our polity. But it's, in some ways, it's the same as when we were simply called ordained, mm-hmm. right? So it doesn't.
So do you lead a congregation or anything, or a group of congregations?
I'm a part-time associate pastor.
Okay.
I teach full-time at the seminary and my work with the university in Bangor. But I'll preach every Wednesday night at our congregation. I lead a Sunday school class. I'll occasionally preach on Sunday morning.
I'd like to go to that. I don't have to go to Cleveland.
Well, you'd be very welcome. The church is in Athens.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I'm involved in local service. I'll usually lead us in times of praying for the sick, and we call people forward who ask for prayer. and other members will join them. So yeah, I'm in the local church. I also serve on what's called the Church and Pastors Council, the local leaders in the church. So yeah, I have been on the point leading the congregation when we've been in a pastoral change. And so I've kind of filled in that. So anyway, I'm pretty involved in the local church.
Okay.
In fact, I know they know that I teach at the seminary, but one of the nice things about being 30 miles removed is that I'm just Chris or Pastor Chris there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So I know we've got LDS congregations, and then a group of those make up a stake, and then lots of stakes. I think a stake is similar to a Catholic diocese. Do you have and then we've got the 12 apostles and the prophet, of course. Is there like a similar type structure with holiness?
Well, the Pentecostal church I'm part of will have a district that might have 8 to 10 churches on it.
Okay.
And then there will be multiple districts in a state or a territory. For instance, in Tennessee, there's one bishop over the state. In Georgia, I think we're divided into North Georgia and South Georgia. So in the West here in our church, it's called the Rocky Mountain region, which would be Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. I can't remember if Montana's part of that. Then we've got a northwest region, because we're not quite as populous in the west as we are in the southeast.
Yeah, I know you're very
and Assemblies of God is a lot larger than we in the west. So for example, at Logan, there's an Assemblies of God church I attend when I'm in Logan, that's just down the street. If you're driving past the stadium, it's like a mile and a half down the road on the right or on the left, and it's a pretty thriving church. They have a couple of services on Sunday morning because of the number of people that attend. And I really enjoyed my worship experiences there.
So as far as Pentecostalism, would you kind of call them cousin churches? You've got Assemblies of God, Holiness, trying to remember, Foursquare, isn't that another one?
Yeah.
Are there any others?
Yeah, you got Pentecostal Holiness, you've got Foursquare, you got Assemblies of God, you got Church of God, you've got Church of God in Christ, which is predominantly African American, but have had a place for integrated worship for going back to the beginning of the movement, really. And they're they may be the largest in the United States of those groups, though the AG, the Assemblies of God's pretty large. I think worldwide, the Church of God's probably about 16 million.
Okay.
But you've got this vast movement of Pentecostals and Charismatics that often get numbered somewhere between 400 and 600 million globally. It's nuts. It's so huge.
Wow. So the Pentecostal movement among all those churches are how many?
How many people? Because you got lots of smaller little churches. You got a lot of oneness churches. I don't know what those numbers are. Maybe 70 to 90 million globally.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty big.
So you've got a group called the Church of Pentecost. It's headquartered in Ghana, Accra, Ghana, that have a number of congregations spread throughout the United States. So it's real hard to keep track of, especially since we're not very correlated.
Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything else we've missed? Anything else you'd like to bring up?
Oh, I'm sure there is, but there'll be other days, I imagine.
That's right. We'll have to have you back on when I remember.
Right.
All right, well, let me just say, why don't you hold up the book again?
Oh.
If you don't have a copy of A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon, go get it. It's a fantastic book. And even if you're Mormon, you can skip part 1 because you know most of that. But the rest of it, I think, is awesome because you just bring such an interesting perspective. I think it's a great book. So.
Well, thanks, Rick, and I appreciate you having me on.
All right, well, thanks again.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Christopher Thomas. Chris, thanks so much for sitting down with me. Your book is awesome. A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. So whether you're Mormon or Pentecostal or evangelical or whatever, I encourage you to buy this book. If you don't know anything about the Book of Mormon, it's a good primer for the Book of Mormon. It will teach you a lot. And if you're Mormon, you're going to get an outside perspective on it. So it's a fantastic book. You definitely want to check it out. In our next conversation, I'm excited to bring an astrophysicist on the show. And he's got an amazing background in ancient calendars where we're going to talk about the dating of Christ's birth as well as the first vision.
I'm from the House of Parley. My dad is his great-grandson.
Okay.
And
so you're Mormon royalty.
No one's ever considered me that, I've grown up in the LDS Church, absolutely, and I inherited some of Orson Pratt's. They knew I was an astronomer, even as a teenager.
Yeah, we're
had
definitely
had
talk
my
about
own
that.
telescope, so I got to inherit some of Orson Pratt's books and things.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe for just $5 a month at patreon.com/GospelTangents, and you can hear the entire interview before everybody else. If you'd like to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can either subscribe on YouTube, Patreon, or my website, GospelTangents.com. Just click the yellow subscribe button, and I'll add you to our Gospel Tangents Insiders group so that you can see entire videos. For those interested in a PDF transcript, you can subscribe at either Patreon or on my website. For just $10 a month, I'll send you a PDF as soon as it's complete. If you'd like a copy of the paperback as well as a PDF, just sign up for $20 a month at either Patreon or my website, GospelTangents.com. Of course, you can buy individual transcripts at Amazon.com and just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you can see all the things that we have there. Don't forget to support Gospel Tangents with an awesome t-shirt like one of these. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/GospelTangents. Get our latest updates at Facebook.com/GospelTangents. Also, you can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got more of our great videos. Thanks again.